Hello everybody, this is lesson 18 of the lecture Macroeconomics. I will discuss the slides 71 to 87 of chapter 4, the Keynesian model. In this lesson we will investigate a change of the demand for investment goods under the assumptions of the Keynesian cross. What happens if the equilibrium on the market for goods is disturbed by a sudden increase in investment demand? Investment demand might, for example, suddenly grow if private firms expect an increase of future investment returns. In the initial situation, the demand for investment goods equals here 5 units, which corresponds to the length of one little quad. Let's assume now that the demand for investment goods grows by 5 units, or the length of one little quad. As a result, the demand curve shifts upward by 5 units. This causes the intersection point of the demand curve with the 45-degree line to move upward to this place here. In the new equilibrium, GDP is 10 units larger as it was before in the old equilibrium. This is an astonishing result because it means that an increase of demand by 5 units causes an increase of total production by 10 units. How is this possible? To find an answer to this question, let's analyze the composition of demand in the new equilibrium at a GDP level of 30. Consumption demand equals the consumption ratio of 50% times 30 units GDP, what equals 15 units consumption, the length of this line segment here. The length of 3 little quads corresponds to 15 units. Government consumption is unchanged, equal to 5 units, while investment demand for investment goods has grown from 5 units to 10 units. This means while investment demand has grown by 5 units, consumption demand has also grown by 5 units from a level of 20 units in the initial situation to a level of 25 units in the new situation. So consumption has grown by 5 units. This means the additional increase of GDP by 5 units comes from an increase of consumption demand by households. This is also implied by the multiplier, which equals 2, as we have already seen, if the consumption ratio is equal to 50%. A multiplier of 2 times the increase in investment goods demand of 5 means that total GDP will grow by 10. But why does this additional consumption growth by 5 units result? The following graphical analysis shows that it is the Keynesian consumption function which causes this increase of consumption demand. So we will analyze in the following slides in a step-by-step way the consequence of an initial increase of 5 units investment demand on consumption demand. Let's have a look at the primary effect of an increase of investment demand on consumption demand. The increase in investment demand increases the demand for goods first by 5 units. This line segment here corresponds to an increase, primary increase in demand by 5 units, such that immediately after the increase of investment demand, total demand equals now 25. As a result, firms adjust their production to the higher demand and produce 5 additional units GDP. That is the basic Keynesian assumption, that firms adjust their production always to demand. So if demand grows, firms will produce the increase in demand additionally and supply it. And that means that this supply of goods increases also household income, because household income corresponds to GDP. So we have now an increase of production from 20 to 25. This means households have an increase of income by 5 units. This increase in household income causes now an increase in household consumption. An increase of household income by 5 units causes an increase of household consumption by 2.5 units. Since the consumption ratio of 50% times the increase of income of 5 results in an increase in consumption demand equal to 2.5. So we have here an increase equal to the length of half such a little quad, and that means 2.5 units. This increase in consumption demand causes now private firms to produce an additional amount of 2.5 units of GDP. And this additional production causes household incomes to grow again, now by 2.5 units. And this additional increase in household income causes then an additional increase in consumption by 1.25 units now, since consumption ratio of 50% times the increase of income of 2.5 results in an increase in consumption equal to 1.25. And now this process goes on. The increase in consumption demand causes private firms to produce an additional amount of 1.25 units GDP. This additional production causes households' income to grow again, now by 1.25 units. And this process will now go on for a while. Since the consumption ratio is smaller than 100%, the increase of consumption caused by an increase in income gets smaller and smaller. It finally converges to zero, as is mathematically proved in the following digression. So we finally end up in the new equilibrium point here, marked by the intersection point between the new demand curve and the 45-degree line. This step-by-step graphical analysis clearly shows the important role of the Keynesian consumption function. Keynesian consumption function boosts an initial increase in demand, in this case by 5 units, to a final increase of 10 units. So the Keynesian consumption function has the effect of a fortifier or a booster. Another way to analyze this multiplier process is this verbal numerical description. An increase in investment demand by 5 causes an increase in total supply, which does always adjust to total demand, by 5. This causes an increase in household income by 5. This increase in income by 5 and a consumption ratio of 50% causes an increase in consumption by 50% times 5, which is equal to 2.5. This causes an increase in household income by 2.5. This increase in household income by 2.5 and a consumption ratio of 50% causes an additional increase in consumption by 0.5 times 2.5, which equals 1.25. This additional increase in consumption demand by 1.25 causes an increase in total supply by 1.25. This causes an increase in household income by 1.25. This additional increase in household income and the consumption ratio of 50% causes an increase in consumption by 0.5 times 1.25, which equals 0.625, and so on and so on. So after this quite thorough analysis of the multiplier process, we will take it for granted in the following. So much for this lesson. In the next lesson, we will analyze the consequences of financing the demand for investment goods with credits on the capital market.